I used to think courage was a noise. The clatter of oars against a wooden hull. The shout you throw at a wave so it knows your name. The scrape of a knife on a whetstone before dawn when the fish still believe they belong to themselves. I was good at that kind of sound. My voice could fill a boat and bully a storm. But courage is not a noise. I learned that under a courtyard sky where the fire crackled and still could not warm me. They call me Peter now like it is the only name I ever had. Rock, foundation, boldness in sandals. But in Galilee, before the titles, I was just a fisherman with a brother and an old boat that smelled of brine and rope. Strength was simple then. Pull the net, mend the tear, feed the house, sleep without asking the sea for permission. Then he came walking the shoreline, speaking in a tone that didn't wrestle with the world so much as invite it to become honest. "Follow me," he said, "the way sunrise says it to darkness." And I did. Loudly, of course. My feet moved before my mind remembered to ask where. We learned him in layers. First as a rabbi who could read scripture like it was remembering him, then as a man whose hands made broken things reconsider their loyalties. I watched blind eyes widen to admit color, watched lepers touch their children with fingers that had forgotten what skin meant. I am not ashamed to say I loved the applause that followed us like gulls. A fisherman understands crowds. He multiplies bread, and your chest swells as if you baked it. He calms a storm, and your lungs swell as if you commanded the wind yourself. Pride is a clever parasite. It eats in the dark and compliments the host. On the mountain, when the light clothed him in itself and the prophets arrived like memory made flesh, it was my mouth that sprinted into holiness with plans. "Let me build shelters," I said, as if eternity needed carpentry. We all have our languages of fear. Mine was helpfulness. I hammer when I should worship. I fill silence with sentences when the only honest act is to kneel. He didn't scold me that day. He let the voice from the cloud do it gently. Listen to him. I tucked the command into my belt with my knife and promptly forgot both at the first sign of trouble. In the upper room, the air was thick with oil and dread. He knelt with a towel and a basin and washed the dust that had proofed itself into our heels. I protested with the kind of humility that smells suspiciously like control. "You will never wash my feet." He looked up at me from the floor, God below me, and said words that should have broken the world. "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." My bravado flipped like a fish in a net. "Then wash all of me," I said, "because if there is one thing I am reliable for, it is excess at the wrong temperature." When he said, "One of you will betray me," my hands found the table as if wood could anchor shame. You would think my first fear would be Judas, but it was me. I know my own heart. It has cliffs. I swore the way men swear when their heartbeat is a drumline and their eyes are full of campfire. Even if all fall away, I will not. Even if I must die, I will follow. He turned to me with sadness that rinsed the room. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Prophecy should feel like a map. To me it felt like a trapdoor. I laughed in the tone brave men use to make fear obey. I called him Lord and called myself faithful. The table tasted of salt, and I blamed the bread. Gethsemane was a bruise pressed into the city's edge where olive trees bent close like old men conspiring. He asked us to watch and pray. I could lift a net soaked with the lake's stubbornness, but the weight of an hour crushed my eyelids. 3 times he returned with the kind of grief that has learned not to raise its voice. "Could you not watch with me 1 hour?" I reached for excuses and found only the warm treachery of sleep. If failure had a smell, it would be crushed leaves and iron. When the torches came, courage returned like an overeager dog. I seized a sword. I am not trained for elegance. I swing like a man who thinks force is a synonym for faith. Metal met flesh. An ear fell. The night inhaled. He rebuked me with a kindness that cut deeper than any blade. "Put your sword back. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then he healed the wound my zeal had manufactured, as if to remind the universe that mercy outruns my best intentions. They bound him, and every knot tied around his wrists cinched around my lungs. I followed at a distance that felt like a confession. You can love a man deeply and still prefer to love him from the safe side of the shadows. The courtyard opened like a mouth. Fire sat in the middle, cracking its small talk into the cold, and I found a seat among the servants and guards, as if proximity could pass for loyalty. I warmed my hands over flames that had no interest in warming my heart. A servant girl looked at me the way women look at fishermen who lie about their catch. "You were with him," she said, not cruelly, almost curious. I had rehearsed bravery in boats and mountains. I had not rehearsed it under the eyes of a child. "I do not know what you mean," I said, words choosing the quickest path to safety. The fire popped like sarcasm. Another accused. I dodged. A third pushed. My tongue, now fluent in survival, swore oaths to exile truth from my face. Somewhere a rooster found his note, and the dawn began to bother the horizon. He turned. My lord, my friend, my teacher turned, and his eyes found me with the precision of love. They were not knives. They were a mirror. In them I saw the fisherman, the mountain fool, the sword, the sleep, the smoke, the lies stacking like kindling. The bird finished its song. I finished coming apart. This is the part, you know. I went outside and wept with the kind of sound you make when a wave you trusted hands you back to the sky. But that is not the only noise the night learned from me. The other sound was smaller, the brittle snap of the courage I had mistaken for myself. The courtyard fire kept talking to the air. It did not chase after me. Flames never pursue. They test who will enter. I did not. I left my bravado huddled on a bench and stepped into a morning that would put nails into innocence. I have told you I used to think courage was a noise. Here, where the night first unlearned me, I began to hear what it truly is. The quiet a man chooses when he stops lying to God about what he is made of. I left the courtyard and walked until the city thinned into silence, until the torches behind me became stars. My tears had nowhere to land, so they fell into dust. The streets were filling with rumor, soldiers dragging him from one mock trial to another, priests whispering verdicts before dawn, the crowd being summoned like wolves that hadn't eaten in days. I wanted to run back, to tell them they had the wrong man, but my tongue was still stiff with fear. Every time I opened my mouth, I could still taste denial. When the hammer struck the nails, I was not there. I wish I could tell you I was brave enough to stand beneath the cross, but I was hiding behind walls built from guilt. The sky itself seemed to mourn what I lacked the courage to witness. I felt the ground tremble, and somewhere in the distance, a sound like the tearing of a curtain broke the air. The whole world shuddered as if heaven itself was gasping. I realized then, he had known all along. The prophecy wasn't punishment. It was permission. He let me fall so that when he rose, I would know exactly what I was being lifted from. For days I wandered the city like a ghost who hadn't realized he was dead. The others were scattered too, each one nursing his own failure. Thomas buried himself in doubt. John carried his mother like a living wound. And me. I carried the sound of that rooster, its echo chasing me through every sunrise. Every dawn felt like judgment, yet every dawn also came, proof that even the world had forgiven enough to start again. Then came the morning we heard the impossible. The women burst into the room breathless, eyes wide as prophecy. "The tomb is empty," they said. My heart stuttered. Empty was not a word you expect from death. I ran. I don't even remember deciding to run. My feet moved faster than thought, faster than fear. The wind whipped against my face, tearing at the shame that had built itself into armor. When I reached the tomb, the stone was rolled away. Inside, only linen remained, folded with a tenderness that made my knees give out. John caught up behind me, but I barely noticed. The world had narrowed to that space. Absence, light, and something electric in the air that felt like forgiveness about to take shape. I couldn't speak. For once, words, my constant betrayers, refused to interfere. I understood then, he hadn't come back for vengeance. He had come back for us. For cowards, for liars, for the loud ones who fail in silence. For me. I returned to the house with the others, and the air trembled with fear and hope colliding. Then, without warning, he was there. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but alive. The same eyes that had met mine across that courtyard found me again. They didn't accuse, they invited. "Peace be with you," he said. And something inside me, something rusted and splintered, broke open. Peace. for the man who had broken his promise. Peace, for the one who swore he would die for him and instead hid behind shadows. It was too much, and yet, it was exactly enough. He didn't call me by name that night. He didn't have to. The silence between us was already a language. But later, by the water, when he asked, "Do you love me?" 3 times, one for each denial, I understood. Love was not a declaration. It was a restoration. Every "Yes, Lord," I whispered rebuilt the bridge I had burned. Every tear that fell into the sea became a baptism. And that is the story of my return. The night that broke me became the morning that built the church. Courage is not a noise. It is a confession. It is a fisherman with trembling hands saying, yes, to love again. When he appeared by the water that morning, the world had just begun to forgive itself for what it had done. The sea smelled like memory, salt, smoke, and a hint of resurrection. We had gone back to fishing, not because we no longer believed, but because belief alone doesn't fill empty nets. I threw the line into the gray dawn and felt nothing. The silence between waves mocked me. Then a voice from the shore, "Cast your net on the other side." The tone, steady, patient, caught in my chest like the first breath after drowning. We obeyed without thinking, and the net came alive. It strained, heavy with abundance, the ropes trembling with the weight of second chances. John's eyes widened. "It is the Lord," he whispered. I didn't wait for the boat to turn. I threw myself into the water. Every stroke toward that shoreline was a confession. My legs burned, but my heart was louder than my lungs. When I reached the sand, he was there, alive, calm, and somehow still carrying the stillness of death. A small fire crackled beside him. Bread and fish hissed in the flame. The sight was unbearable and beautiful at once. God making breakfast for cowards. He didn't speak right away. The others came ashore, hauling the net that glittered with silver life. I sat a few feet away, dripping and wordless. The same fire that had once illuminated my betrayal now warmed my trembling hands. When he finally turned to me, I felt the old panic, the same fear from the courtyard, rise again. But his gaze was soft, not sharp. "Simon, son of Jonah," he said, using the name I had before I tried to make myself into something larger. "Do you love me more than these?" I nodded too fast. "Yes, Lord. You know that I love you." He didn't smile. "Feed my lambs." The words landed like a riddle, heavy with purpose. Then again, softer this time, "Do you love me?" My throat tightened. "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Take care of my sheep." By the third question, my eyes burned. He wasn't repeating himself. He was restoring me. One question for every denial. 3 wounds closed with love instead of judgment. I broke then, not from shame, but from grace too large for my body. "Lord, you know everything," I said. "You know that I love you." "Feed my sheep," he said again, and the world shifted back into place. That morning was not about forgiveness. It was about transformation. I had wanted to die the night I denied him, but he refused to let my failure be the end of my story. He took the sound of a rooster, my symbol of shame, and turned it into the call of a shepherd. When the sun rose fully, its light fell across his face, and I understood at last what he had been teaching all along. Faith is not about not falling. It's about what you do after the fall. It's about running toward the fire you once feared, diving into the water you once sank in, and answering the same question 3 times until your heart learns to believe your own yes. That was the morning courage stopped being noise and became love. After that morning, the sea became my teacher again. Each wave whispered the same lesson in a different tongue. Rise, fall, rise. Faith, I learned, is not the absence of sinking. It is the decision to keep swimming toward the voice that calls you out of the storm. He stayed with us for 40 days, and every sunrise carried a new miracle. He broke bread, walked through locked doors, spoke of peace as if it were a tangible thing we could hold in our hands. Sometimes I caught him watching me with that same gaze from the courtyard, piercing yet kind. It no longer made me flinch. It made me remember who I was becoming. We gathered on a hillside once more, just like the beginning. The wind was warm, filled with the smell of grass and promise. He spoke of what would come, the spirit, the fire, the message carried to every shore. My heart swelled and broke at the same time. I didn't want him to go again, not after everything. Lord, I said, will you restore the kingdom to Israel now? He smiled that same quiet smile, the one that always carried both patience and prophecy. It is not for you to know the times, he said, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. I didn't understand then what kind of power he meant. Not swords, not thrones. It was something far more dangerous. The power to forgive yourself and others endlessly. When he ascended, it was like watching light remember where it came from. The cloud swallowed him, and the air turned holy with silence. We stood there stunned, staring at the sky until two angels broke our trance. Why do you stand looking into heaven? They asked. I could have answered them, but the truth would have been too small for words. I wasn't looking for him in the clouds. I was trying to find him in myself. After that, the waiting began. We stayed in a small upper room, the same one where bread had once broken our hearts and wine had carried his promise. Every creak of the floor sounded like memory. Every gust of wind through the window felt like a question. Will you stand when the fire comes? When the fire did come, it was nothing like the one in that courtyard. It didn't flicker with accusation, it roared with mercy. Tongues of flame rested on us, but they did not burn, they cleansed. My heart, once ash, began to glow again. The words I had once used to deny him now carried his name with power I couldn't have imagined. I spoke, and people listened, not to me, but to the truth moving through me. That's the miracle no one tells you about. The same mouth that once said, I don't know him, became the voice that shouted his story to the world. And I understood at last that courage isn't standing by a fire to prove you're brave. It's letting the fire inside you speak when it's your turn. That day in Jerusalem, when the Spirit descended, I became a different man, or maybe I finally became the man he saw when he first said, Follow me. The streets overflowed with pilgrims from every nation, tongues mixing like rivers into one roar of confusion. But when I spoke, they heard their own languages. I don't know how, I only know that the words weren't mine anymore. They came like wind through my chest, alive and unstoppable. 3,000 souls were baptized that day. 3,000. Fishermen, merchants, widows, soldiers, all washed clean in the same water that once carried my tears. I saw their faces change, the way dawn changes the horizon, and I felt the kingdom begin not with crowns, but with trembling hearts. And I thought of him. Always I thought of him. At night, when the crowd thinned and the lamps flickered low, I would walk alone to the edge of the city where the olive trees still remembered our prayers. I would sit there and whisper the same words he asked me by the sea. Do you love me? I answered every night, Yes, Lord. You know. Because love isn't proven once. It's chosen again and again, especially after failure. The others began to look to me for guidance. They called me the rock, though I still felt like water. We shared everything we had, every loaf and coin. We healed the sick, not by power, but by trust. And sometimes, in the quiet after a miracle, I would feel his presence so near it hurt. Not because it was gone, but because it was everywhere. But peace never stays long where truth has taken root. The priests couldn't stand that his name still echoed in the streets. They threatened us, arrested us, warned us to stay silent. I told them, we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. I meant it. And yet, deep down, I felt the same tremor I had in that courtyard, the old fear knocking from within. When they jailed us, the cell smelled of rust and sweat, but the darkness wasn't heavy. I remembered his promise. You will be my witnesses. Witness. The word sounds noble until you realize it means to watch love bleed and keep believing. They released us, but the message only grew louder. Each healing, each sermon, each broken chain added another layer to the story I was telling with my life. A story not of perfection, but of transformation. I had denied him once out of fear. Now, I would spend the rest of my days denying fear out of love. Still, there were nights when the past crept in. Sometimes I'd wake before dawn, and the crowing of roosters would carry through the alleys. It no longer pierced me like before. Instead, it sounded like a reminder. Faith isn't about forgetting where you fell, it's about remembering who lifted you. I was no longer the man by the fire, nor the fisherman chasing safety. I was a man set aflame by forgiveness. Every scar, every failure, every moment of shame had become proof that mercy does not retire. He had turned my betrayal into a sermon, my cowardice into courage. And in every word I spoke, every hand I lifted, he spoke through me, still patient, still kind, still calling me friend. As the years passed, I began to understand that faith is not built on memories of miracles, but on the endurance of love. The faces of those we healed faded. Even the sound of the rushing wind from Pentecost grew quiet in my mind. But his voice, that steady, impossible calm, never left. It echoed inside me every time I broke bread, every time I forgave an enemy, every time I failed and tried again. We traveled far, through deserts, overseas, into cities that spat our names like curses. Some welcomed us with tears, others with stones. I no longer feared the stones. The man who had once trembled before a servant girl now faced kings without flinching. I had learned the secret he tried to teach us. Fear dies the moment you love something more than your own safety. Still, leadership was a cross I never wanted. The others looked to me as if I carried some divine certainty, but I was still the fisherman who second-guessed every wind. Each decision for the church felt heavier than any net I had ever pulled. Feeding his sheep was not poetry, it was responsibility. And responsibility is a quieter kind of suffering. At times, the memories would ambush me. I would see his face in the eyes of strangers, the poor, the wounded, the outcast. And I would remember that night. The fire, the question, the lie that escaped my lips. It used to shame me. Now it reminded me why I speak with compassion. You can't shepherd others unless you've wandered lost yourself. Persecution grew like weeds. They dragged some of us before councils, others into dungeons. James was the first to die. I remember hearing the news, how he faced the sword without hesitation, and I wept. Not because he was gone, but because I envied his certainty. My time would come, I knew, but the waiting was its own torment. Every sunrise could have been my last, yet I greeted each one like a gift I hadn't earned. Rome was a beast dressed in marble. When I walked its streets, I could feel its hunger for blood beneath the stone. Still, we preached. Some listened in secret, whispering the name of Jesus like it was contraband hope. Others betrayed us to survive. I understood them. Betrayal has a familiar scent, fear mixed with exhaustion. But I also knew that forgiveness could bloom even there. One night, hiding in a cramped room, I dreamt of him again. He stood on the shore, the same as that morning by the fire. But this time he didn't ask, "Do you love me?" He simply smiled and said, "It's almost time." I woke with peace so deep it frightened me. They captured me weeks later. I didn't fight. Some urged me to flee, but I couldn't run anymore. Not from Rome, not from destiny, not from love. The guards bound my hands, the same hands he once washed clean, and I thought of that basin, that towel, that quiet night when God knelt before a man who would deny him. This time, I wouldn't deny him. Not with words. Not with silence. My death would be my final confession, and I would make sure it spoke louder than my fear ever did. They took me through the streets of Rome at dawn. The air was heavy with smoke and the sour scent of wine from the night before. People watched from windows and corners, not with hatred, but with the dull curiosity that cruelty teaches. I could feel the cobblestones beneath my bare feet, cold and honest. Every sound, the rattle of chains, the crack of whips, the echo of sandals, beat in rhythm with my pulse. I wasn't afraid. I had already died once in that courtyard long ago. This was only the body catching up to what the soul had already surrendered. They led me to the hill where executions had become theater. Crosses stood like forest trunks stripped of mercy. I remembered another hill, long ago, under another sky, where another cross had turned death into doorway. I was walking toward that memory now, step by step. Some mocked, others whispered prayers. I walked quietly, hearing his words still alive in me. Asterisk, follow me. Asterisk, I had followed him across waters, across failure, across years. Now I would follow him into the final sea, the one that doesn't return its tides. The guards paused at the place prepared for me. They offered water. I declined. My mouth was dry, but not with thirst, with resolve. The captain read the charges: sedition, blasphemy, corruption of the people. Words recycled from the trial of my teacher. I almost smiled. Rome hadn't learned. They still thought they could crucify truth. When they brought the cross, I touched the wood. It was rough, splintered, real. Not the clean symbol carved into altars centuries later. I ran my fingers across it, feeling both terror and reverence. "Not like my lord," I said. "Turn it upside down." The soldier frowned. "Why?" "Because I am not worthy to die as he did." It wasn't humility. It was honesty. My whole life had been a long climb from cowardice to conviction. I wanted to end it looking at the world from the place where he had first seen me, from the bottom, reaching upward. They obeyed. Nails found their way through flesh as easily as memory. Pain is sharp at first, then infinite. The world blurred into white and sound. I thought of the sea again, the way waves collapse not because they are weak, but because surrender is their nature. I let go. The sky inverted. The ground rose toward me. Blood rushed to my head, but peace rushed faster. As I hung there, the crowd melted into light. Faces became smears of color. I could no longer tell where suffering ended and grace began. Somewhere far off, a rooster crowed. For a heartbeat, I was back in that courtyard. The fire, the denial, the gaze that broke and remade me. Then I heard his voice again, not outside but within. "Feed my sheep." I wanted to answer. I did. But the words dissolved into air before they reached my lips. The world dimmed. I could feel the final wave rising. Not to drown, but to carry. My last thought was simple, steady. I followed you after all. And in that stillness between breath and eternity, I knew I was finally free. They say that when a man dies for what he believes, the world remembers his courage. But courage was never what I wanted to be remembered for. If anything, I wanted to be remembered for love, the messy, trembling kind that chooses to stay even when faith feels like a wound. As the light dimmed around me, I thought of faces. Not cities, not miracles, not sermons, just faces. The boy whose leg was healed by a word. The mother who wept when her child breathed again. The thief on a cross beside him, whose final breath became a prayer. I remembered their eyes, how they all looked the same in that instant when they realized they were loved by something too vast to fit into a lifetime. That's what I saw when I looked at him, the impossible tenderness of God. The pain in my body began to blur into something else, like waves dissolving into mist. My heartbeat slowed, but my mind stayed sharp, replaying every mistake, every laugh, every miracle I had witnessed. I remembered walking on water for those brief, impossible steps. The spray of salt, the shock of balance, the sheer absurdity of standing where no one should stand. I remembered sinking too, the taste of the sea when fear clawed through faith. Yet even then, his hand had been there, strong and certain. I had never fallen beyond his reach. Now, as the world turned upside down, I saw it all differently. My failures were not endings. They were invitations. Every denial, every doubt, every crack in my faith had been a place where his grace entered. I had thought he chose me because I was strong. I see now that he chose me because I wasn't. The sky above me, or below, depending on how you look at it, burned red with the dying sun. The light poured into my eyes, and for a moment, I felt as if heaven was leaning closer, curious about the story of a fisherman who had once tried to walk on water. I wanted to tell it again, not as legend, but as truth. I wanted to say, faith doesn't keep you from sinking. It teaches you who pulls you out. My breath grew shallow. I could hear the muffled sobs of a few believers standing far from the soldier's sight. Their prayers reached me like ripples across time. Remember, I wanted to tell them. Remember that he chose you too. Not because you are unbreakable, but because he loves the sound of things being mended. The pain faded completely now, replaced by a strange warmth. I felt suspended between earth and eternity. Not falling, not rising, just held. The last thing I saw was light flooding everything. The kind of light that doesn't ask for permission. I let go of my last breath, and for the first time since Galilee, I wasn't afraid. And somewhere beyond the noise of the world, I heard it, his voice clear as water. "Welcome home, Peter." I do not know how long I drifted in that light, if time even dared to exist there. It was not a place made of distance, but of remembrance. Every heartbeat I had ever lived unfolded at once. The laughter of boats rocking in the Galilean dawn, the thunder of waves that once obeyed his voice, the quiet sobs of men who had lost everything and found eternity instead. It was not judgment that met me, it was recognition. I expected fire, a reckoning, a divine ledger of debts and failures. Instead, I found warmth. It was not the fire that burns, it was the one that welcomes. He stood there, not robed in gold or surrounded by choirs, but as he had always been, familiar, human, and utterly unafraid of my brokenness. His eyes still carried the same gentleness that once stopped a storm. When he looked at me, I remembered what grace feels like. Not earned, not demanded, simply given. "Peter," he said, and the sound of my name dissolved the last shadow I had been carrying. I wanted to fall at his feet, but he raised me before I could kneel. "You followed me farther than you ever believed you could." I tried to speak, to confess again, to explain how many times I had failed, but he shook his head. "You never understood," he said softly. "It was never about what you could do for me. It was always about what my love could do through you." Behind him, I saw others, faces I had not seen in years, but remembered as if from a dream. John smiling with that calm certainty he carried like breath. Mary with her eyes shining like answered prayers. Stephen, whose courage had once shamed me, now radiant in the same peace that filled this place. Even Judas was there, or something of him, standing far off, weeping into the light. I felt no bitterness, only the strange relief of a circle closing. He turned to me again, and I saw not a teacher, not a king, but a friend. "Do you see now?" he asked. "You thought the story was about denial and forgiveness. But it was always about transformation." His words were not spoken to my ears. They moved through me, stitching together every torn piece of my soul. "Your faith was never about being perfect, Peter. It was about being real. About falling and rising and falling again, and still choosing love." I looked around and realized there was no distance left between heaven and earth, between God and man, between failure and redemption. Everything was held together by the same light, the same voice that had called me from my boat, from my pride, from my fear. He smiled again. "The world remembers you as the rock," he said. "But I remember you as the one who listened when I said, 'Come.'" And with those words, the sea returned, not of water but of light, and I stepped into it without hesitation. For the first time, I was not walking on the waves. I was walking with them. If memory were ashore, I think I would still be standing there, watching the tide erase the footprints of everything I used to be. The fisherman, the coward, the apostle, the martyr, all of them different ripples of the same life, folding back into the same ocean. In the world below, they would tell stories of me. Some true, most not. They'd say I was the first pope, the foundation of a church. Others would call me a saint, or worse, an example. But I was never any of those things. I was a man who loved his friend, who failed him publicly, and who learned that failure is not the opposite of faith. It's the proof of it. In those final moments before eternity swallowed time, I thought about that night on the lake again. The wind screaming, the waves clawing at the sides of the boat, and that one impossible voice calling my name. Asterisk, come. Asterisk I had stepped out, terrified, and for a few miraculous seconds, the sea forgot its weight. Then I looked down, and sank. That moment used to shame me. Now I understand it. Faith isn't about staying above the water. It's about knowing who pulls you back every time you sink. Here, in the silence beyond pain, I could see the pattern of everything. How denial became devotion, how weakness became witness, how death became doorway. Every wound I had carried turned into light, each scar humming with the memory of the one who never left. The cross that once broke me had become the key that opened the gate. I looked for him again, but this time he wasn't in front of me. He was everywhere. In the light, in the stillness, in the space between what I had been and what I was becoming. His presence wasn't a figure to see, but a certainty to rest in. And for the first time, I felt what he had meant when he said, "I am with you always." Voices rose like wind through the trees. Those I had loved, those who had followed, those who had died believing. Together, we weren't praying or singing. We were remembering. The story was never about victory over death. It was about love that refused to be undone by it. As the last thread of the world slipped from my grasp, I realized something simple and sacred. The miracle was never that I walked on water. The miracle was that he trusted me to try. And so, I opened my hands, not to hold, but to release. The light deepened, not blinding but infinite. I stepped forward one last time, into everything he had promised. For once, I did not look back.